All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 31, The Cold War and Decolonization, 1945 through 1975. We'll be looking at Section 1, The Cold War. So in terms of where we're at chronologically, recall that Chapter 30 was all about World War II. That war ended in 1945. And then after that, we typically there are two major trends in world history. One of them is the Cold War, which we'll talk about in this particular section. The other one is the process of decolonization. Decolonization is the process by which former nations that were colonized by imperial powers become independent. So during the era of imperialism, roughly 1800 to 1914, the industrial powers of the world carved up approximately 85% of the globe's territory. After World War II, all of those parts around the world become independent nations. And that's so these two things are roughly going on at the same time. So first of all, the Cold War. In terms of describing what the Cold War is, maybe the best summary of it is that it's an ideological. We'll use the term war. Again, it's called the Cold War, but there wasn't actually any direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, who were the two major participants in it, but there was indirect fighting. So sometimes this term cold is used to describe the fact that no direct war broke out, but instead it was kind of like the tensions between these two sides. It's ideological in a sense that it's based off of ideas, and that's kind of the basis of it. So an ideological war between the United States and Soviet Union. And of course, the ideas under which each one stands for. The United States is primarily promoting the ideas of capitalism, that is private ownership of business and democracy, voting in elections. And the Soviet Union is promoting communism, which is essentially, well, it's communism, but it's essentially socialism, government ownership, right? So individual ownership in a capitalist system, the people own things. In the Soviet Union, it is the government that owns things. And of course, that would be communally owned, not necessarily individually owned. And really a one-party system. And that is to say that, there are elections that take place in the Soviet Union, but it's only within the Communist Party. So it's just one single Communist Party that essentially makes all the decisions. So these are the ideas that are essentially at stake with one another. Now, this term Cold War, it really becomes much more important after 1945, but you could already say that, when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917 and communism was established, that the capitalist nations were already at least a little bit hesitant, if not openly hostile towards it. But when World War II came about, both the Soviet Union and the United States had a common enemy in Germany. Once that enemy was defeated, then the ideological difference between the states and the Soviet Union became all the more important. Sometimes this divide is described as an iron curtain. So an iron curtain is, sometimes we'll say the term to describe the division between, in this case, East and West. And again, in terms of what these stand for, East, that's the Soviet Union. The West, actually, that's kind of confusing. So that would be the Soviets. And in the West, that would be the United States. It was used to describe Europe at the time. Europe was clearly divided between West and East, capitalism and communism, right through the middle of Germany. And so again, Cold War, we already have our definition for what the Cold War is. It's an ideological, it's a war of ideas, essentially, between the United States and the Soviet Union. It did very much have the risk to turn deadly. Of course, we know today, after having, gone through the Cold War, we know that the United States and the Soviet Union did not directly fight one another, but there was certainly the possibility, and each side created their own military alliances The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was the military alliance between the US and their allies. The Warsaw Pact was between the Soviet Union and allies. And so kind of like in the case of World War I, what these military alliances presupposed was that if a conflict between the Soviets and the Americans broke out, then it would involve a lot of other nations. And maybe a little bit more on the dangerous side, what it suggested is that if a minor confrontation broke out between some of the allied powers, right? So if an ally of the Soviet Union and an ally of the United States went to war, then it would bring in these much, much bigger powers. And in fact, a lot of the Cold War, from both the perspective of the US and the Soviet Union, is fear of making a larger conflict, right? And this really underlines both the Soviet Union and the United States. This is coming off the back of World War II, when there really aren't any other global powers that challenge the United States and the Soviet Union. Sometimes the term superpower is used to describe the Soviets and the Americans. The Soviets and the Americans were on the winning side of World War II. Countries like the French, for example, which were great powers in the world prior to World War II, were defeated by Germany. Germany's obviously defeated. Japan's defeated. Great Britain does emerge on the victorious side, but the British are, really damaged by the war. The British were the ones who fought the war the longest of the allied or victorious powers. They were the ones at a certain point who were fighting Germany alone. And they have demands amongst their colonial empire for independence. And so the British are sort of knocked down from maybe the first tier powers down to the second or third tier. And the United States and the Soviet Union are really the only ones that can challenge one another in terms of the economies, their militaries, technology, etc., etc. Now, despite this, there were efforts to try to create a more peaceful world in the post-World War II era. World War II was the deadliest and most destructive war in human history, so there were certainly vested interests in trying to maintain a peaceful world. The United Nations, this was the second international peacekeeping organization. Recall last time we talked about the first one, the League of Nations, which was created, L-E-A-G-U-E, League of Nations, which was created after World War I, but that was a huge failure, right? And so the United Nations is meant to be, again, the kind of better peacekeeping organization. One thing that makes the United Nations different than the League of Nations is the fact that it does have an armed force, so it can actually enforce what the resolutions are. It contains members from around the world, but also permanent members, or the Security Council. And the Security Council were more or less the victorious powers in World War II, And so the Security Council members, or the members that have veto power, because veto is the power to reject any resolution. So these 5 countries have the power to veto. They include the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, F-R-A-N-C-E, France, and China. All right, China battling the Japanese during World War II. So any of these countries here, in order for the United Nations to pass a resolution, all 5 of these countries have to agree. The reality of the United Nations is that even though it was created, I think 1940, maybe 1947, that date might be off, but created very, very shortly after World War II, even though it was a kind of effort by the Allied powers to create global peace, because of the Cold War and the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union both have veto power, they essentially just veto themselves. And for most of the Cold War, the United Nations is primarily, it's kind of non-effective for the most part, because the Cold War competition between the Soviets and the Americans gets in the way and results in pretty much both of those nations just vetoing any sort of resolution. Meanwhile, the development of the 2 economic systems makes this competition or conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States global. Again, capitalism and communism These are economic systems. And again, kind of the basic, one of the most basic ways to sort of understand how capitalism and communism interact and what are the sort of the key tenets of it. Probably one of the most important things is this idea of private property. In a capitalist system, private property is almost sacred. It's protected. In a communist system, private property, in theory, shouldn't exist. In other words, nothing should be individually owned, but instead it should be owned by the state or the government. And that's really what the Soviet model depends on. So both the Soviet system and the United States and their allies really created two separate economic systems. The international monetary system, monetary essentially just means money. The United States and their allies met in Bretton Woods. So this was a conference to create a global capitalist economy. This was happening in the aftermath of World War II, and the idea was to, in a lot of cases, create a post-World War II system that would foster international trade, that would benefit the Allied nations, but also to rebuild Europe in the aftermath of the war. That was also a goal for Bretton Woods. It established some tools for international finance, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, also the World Bank. Both of these things were designed to really foster global economic growth. The Soviet Union was not part of the agreement. They pretty much didn't sign on to it. But essentially what the Bretton Woods Agreement did was not only create various international institutions of finance to help other countries to rebuild Europe after the war, to invest in developing nations, but also created a monetary system that pretty much put gold as the basis, US dollars as kind of the second basis, and then pretty much base all other international currency on the US dollar. So the United States came out of this in a pretty prime position. So again, the United States agreed to keep the dollar attached to gold. Again, monetary, money, this is what the system is about. All other international currencies agreed to keep reserves of US dollars. So it was kind of like a tiered system. But in other words, the Bretton Woods Agreement more or less made the US dollar, for the nations that participated in it, kind of like the basis currency of the world. The United States agreed to keep it based on gold. That was the case until 1971. After that, we say typically we have floating currencies. We don't tie our currency to anything of concrete value. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, did not engage in this international system. Instead, they maintained a command economy, a sort of an insulated economy, you might say. So, we'll talk a little bit about the Soviet command economy here, but it was pretty much a economy that was based off of quotas, specifically in things like steel, iron, electricity, other sort of, oil maybe, other major industrial products. Whereas in the United States, like we mentioned before, in terms of who made the economic decisions, well, it was the individual people who owned it. In terms of who made the decisions in the Soviet economy, it was the government, right? So bureaucracies were set up. They established quotas for what should be made. Okay, make this much rubber, make this much iron, make this much steel. In the United States and other capitalist nations, it's just whatever companies want to make, right? U.S. Steel Company can make how much ever steel that they want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The differences in economies became clear, not immediately after the war was over, but certainly in the decades after. Western Europe went through a dramatic, so Western Europe was U.S. allied, IED, went through a dramatic economic recovery, right, especially after the war years, thanks in part to a couple things. First of all, the Marshall Plan. This was the U.S. Policy to fund European recovery. In other words, the United States believed that the best protection against the growing spread of Soviet influence or the growing spread of communism was to rebuild Europe in a way that made their economies stable but also capitalist. And so the United States invested, pretty much poured money on Europe to rebuild their economies in order to prevent any type of influence from the Soviet system. European countries also came together to create a common economic system. The Common Market or European Economic Community, later renamed to the European Union when other nations joined, essentially created one single European economy. This made it easier to create investments in foreign nations. It created a common currency, so it was easier for European countries to do business with one another, and really aided towards, in a lot of ways, Europe's economic recovery. Meanwhile, the Soviet economy really lagged behind that of Eastern Europe as well. We'll say lagged behind. And the most clear indicator of that was the domestic demand for various consumer products. So, like we said before, in terms of who made what, it was determined by government bureaus. It was determined by quota systems. And what that meant was that consumer demand was really lacking. So consumer goods. The Soviets were really good at making steel, iron, electricity, and oil. In fact, the Soviet Union often outproduced the United States in a lot of these commodities. The difference was when it came to the goods that people wanted. So things like cars, TVs, appliances, even just entertainment stuff. The people in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, or those nations in the East that were part of the Soviet system, entertainment. They wanted all these goods, right? And you could get those in a capitalist economy, but you could not get them in a Soviet economy. And some even say, and there's a good argument to be made, that that was ultimately the reason why the Soviet Union failed. Now, meanwhile, this clear division in economic models is playing against the backdrop of a green revolution. The green revolution is a scientific breakthrough. Oops, man. Trying to spell today, breakthrough, which led to more food, right, and especially enormous population growth. So scientists got really good with creating food, pesticides, chemicals, genetic engineering, to the point where a food source was available and still is available to sustain a huge growth in terms of global population. And we'll talk about this a little bit in a different chapter, but when you look at global population, especially since World War II, it has absolutely exploded and skyrocketed, and the Green Revolution is partially responsible for that. Now, the way that the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States played out, it initially began in Europe, but later on spread to Asia and eventually the globe. So in a lot of ways, the Cold War was something that was focused on Europe first, then had a strong emphasis in Asia, and then was in fact fought all over the world. And that again is the idea of communism and capitalism and which one ought to reign supreme. One of the very first flashpoints were the nations of Turkey and Greece. These were two nations that, at least Greece during World War II was occupied by the Germans. And after World War II was over, the question was, well, what types of government will Turkey and Greece both maintain? Will they go capitalism? Will they go communism? Both the United States and the Soviet Union had an interest in trying to persuade Turkey and Greece to adopt their ideology. Ultimately, it was the US that won out. Both Turkey and Greece became, at the very least, if not capitalist, anti-communist. And from the perspective of the United States, sometimes anti-communism was better than promoting a democracy. So you might have an authoritarian regime or a monarchical regime or some sort of different form of government. But as long as it was anti-communist, that was more or less good enough for the US. Both of them were anti-communist, and both of them became NATO allies. So the United States won at that point, or at least was successful in convincing both of these nations to resist Soviet influence. Probably the first area in which the prospect of conflict came to a head was in Berlin in 1948. After the war was over, Germany, this will be a very bad drawing of Germany, and the capital city of Berlin was divided into 4 territories. This was a division that was meant to be temporary following World War II, but because the United States and the Soviet Union essentially couldn't agree on everything given the atmosphere of the Cold War, Germany remained divided. Initially, it was divided into 4 sections. This was the Soviet zone in Eastern Germany. I think this was, I forget exactly the order under which these ones went, but we'll go ahead and give, we'll give France this one down here, the US, and Great Britain. And in Western Germany, again, like we had mentioned before, in terms of the economic model, it was one that promoted capitalism. In the eastern part of Germany, it was the promotion of communism. The capital city of Berlin, that's what you see at this little island. The capital city of Berlin was also divided in half because while the war was going on, or especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, the idea was that the United States and the Allied powers and the Eastern powers would meet in Berlin to negotiate the treaty in World War II, but that also became a permanent division as well. And so in a lot of cases, you could say that Berlin was an island of capitalism, right, sitting in a sea of communism, and that more or less was the case. Now, what had happened in 1948, as the tensions between the Soviets and the Americans grew, the American side essentially agreed with the other powers to combine their sections together, at least economically. And so these divisions were erased. And instead of having 4 divisions, Germany became a nation divided into 2, simply between West Germany and East Germany. The Soviets, Joseph Stalin, who were not very happy about that, wanted to try and add this part of Western Berlin to the Soviet model. As a result, the Soviet Union blockaded Berlin, that is to cut off supplies from the city, in an effort to try and get Western Berlin to join the Soviet side. The Americans, the British, the French, the Canadians refused to back down. They instead airlifted all the supplies into Berlin, dropping automobiles, dropping coal, dropping food, dropping everything that those people needed. After a year of that went by, the Soviets eventually backed down and Western Berlin stayed in the hands of the capitalists. But it was very much a tense situation because it was believed that perhaps war could break out at any time, given the fact that a city allied with the United States was being cut off from supplies. Both of these very early on were U.S. victories in the Cold War. The United States really was getting the upper hand of the Soviets, at least early on, but then that changed. Given the given the situation in Eastern Europe, especially with the lack of consumer goods and the demands that people in Eastern Europe made for these various commodities, there were a couple of uprisings that took place in Eastern Europe. Both Hungary and Czechoslovakia, both of these were communist states, but communist in a sense that the Soviets had installed them. In 1956 and in 1968, people in Hungary and Czechoslovakia rose up against the Soviet system. The United States, like we mentioned before, did not intervene. Where did we put that, right? The United States did not intervene because, again, their fear of making a much larger conflict. And the response in both Czechoslovakia and Hungary was essentially a Soviet violent suppression of both of these movements. This sort of idea was, I don't know if I spelled that guy's name right, Leonid? Maybe that's his name, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev, who was once premier of the Soviet Union, more or less solidified this doctrine, and that was to protect communism. In other words, If a communist regime around the world was threatened, like Hungary in 1956 when people there wanted to overthrow it, or Czechoslovakia in 1968, Brezhnev said the Soviet Union would intervene militarily, and that's pretty much what the Soviet Union did. So a lot of this was focused on Europe in the very early on, but then it switched globally. The Korean War, in some cases, was kind of the first, quote unquote, hot war of the Cold War. And what we mean by that is, the first real conflict where there was a significant amount of, casualties, of shootings, of bombings, etc., etc. Korea was a country that had previously been conquered by the Japanese. The Japanese lost World War II, and therefore the question was, what's going to happen to Korea? Kind of like Germany, it was eventually divided between the winning powers. It was divided on the 38th parallel, the North belonging to the Soviet Union or having a pro-communist regime, the South being occupied by the United States, having a capitalist regime. And this was against the backdrop of people calling for a unified Korea. Remember or recall that, Korea, this division between North and South really hadn't existed in any significant way before, before the Cold War. And because of Cold War politics, Korea now became divided. The Korean War started when North Korea invaded the South. This happened approximately 1950, and it escalated from there. And to kind of give you an idea of how conflicts during the Cold War worked, this is typically the way that the Soviet Union and the United States indirectly fought one another, because in this conflict, North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union in terms of things like finances, weapons, etc., etc. South Korea was supported by the United States, finances, weapons. And this conflict actually brought in other nations. The United States went in on the side of South Korea. American soldiers fought in Korea, sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War in U.S. history because, for whatever reasons, popular culture or whatever it is, we tend to think of U.S. conflicts from jumping from World War II directly to Vietnam. But U.S. soldiers fought in Korea, and so too did Chinese soldiers, right? China sent troops to North Korea. So Americans and Chinese soldiers fought one another in Korea from 1950 to 1953 when that conflict ended in a stalemate, which gives us today the modern states of North and South Korea, which still exists. And this is a remnant of the Cold War. So again, you can see, at least in this case, the way that both the United States and the Soviet Union can indirectly fight one another. And this happened all the time during the Cold War. We call these proxy wars. Wars in which the superpowers can fight each other indirectly. So if we take a look here at our Cold War map, we can get kind of more of a feel for the way that the world is divided. So in the blue, we have our nations that are allied with NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In red, we have our Warsaw Pact, and every single little explosion thing that you see here, these are all proxy wars. So these are wars in which, there probably is a more direct cause to the conflict. So for example, in Korea, here's the Korean War right here. That's where Korea is located. You could say that this was a war for unification. This was a war between Koreans, but because it carried with it the overtones of communism and capitalism, it brought in a lot more other nations. The stark divide between Europe and the Soviet Union, right here, this is the East versus West divide, right? And this is really where kind of the Cold War centered initially in Europe, but then spread out through the rest of the world. The other sort of things that are being marked on this map, the dark blue squares are military bases. The dark red squares are Soviet military bases. So you can see really heavy militarization in Eastern Europe. And for the most part, when it came to this, ideological showdown between the Soviets and the Americans, there just really wasn't any part of the world that was safe from it, right? Pretty much encapsulated, the entire globe in a lot of cases. Now, there are a lot of proxy wars to talk of. We're not going to go over every single one, but the one that the textbook does focus on is Vietnam, which again is another great example of a Cold War proxy. We might also be a little bit more familiar with the conflict in Vietnam just simply due to the fact that, it was a war that involved the United States. And so therefore, for that reason, we're more familiar with it. Let me check. No, my lighting is a little bit off here. There we go. That looks much better. Okay, so back to Vietnam. So Vietnam was a nation that, so if we look at the history of Vietnam, from about the 1880s to 1940, Vietnam was a French colony, right? During the era of imperialism, the French controlled it, and they controlled it for quite a long time. From 1940 to 1945, it was a Japanese colony, right? The Japanese controlled it. Again, Japan lost World War II. So the question then becomes, well, what's going to happen with Vietnam? Ho Chi Minh, he is sort of the leading Vietnamese nationalist. And his organization, the Viet Minh is a nationalist. And we've talked about organization. We talked about nationalism to death in this, in this text. But what Ho Chi Minh wanted was an independent Vietnam, right? A Vietnam in which Vietnamese people would control it, not the French, not the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh was also, though, a communist. And in fact, a lot of communism, or a lot of people who were drawn to communism, were especially drawn to the aspects of anti-imperialism. For many communists, they wouldn't describe the United States as a capitalist nation. They would describe the United States as an imperialistic nation, right? And if you add Great Britain, if you add France, yes, they're all capitalist, democracies, but they're also all imperialists. And so, communism was very much attractive to those who were seeking to overthrow the imperial order, who were essentially anti-imperialists. After 1945, 1945, the French tried to reconquer Vietnam, right? In an effort to try to reclaim their colonies, they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. So Dien Bien Phu was the battle which thwarted the French reconquest, right? Thwarted French reconquest. The battle that thwarted, and you can't really read that well, French reconquest. And in terms of French conquest of Vietnam, or reconquest after 1945, they were supported by the United States in this. Because the United States supported France, well, it meant that Ho Chi Minh was receiving support from the Soviet Union. Again, a proxy war. Whoever the United States supports, the Soviets want to challenge. Again, they're fighting for these ideas across the globe. After the French surrendered, Vietnam became increasingly divided between two major power points. The North, which was controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Soviets, and the South, which was controlled by Ngo Dinh Diem. So we could say about Diem, he was the leader in the South and was U.S. supported. At this point, the French had left, and instead there was a Vietnam that was separated between North and South, the United States still supporting the South because what Ho Chi Minh represented in the North was communism. And for the United States, it was unacceptable for communism to spread anywhere in the world. The fighters that continued the fight to unite Vietnam were referred to the Viet Cong. These are communist fighters, really guerrilla fighters. The U.S. President John F. Kennedy, U.S. President, he supported Diem. Both Kennedy and Diem were assassinated, and upon that assassination, upon John F. Kennedy's assassination, President LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, came to power. He wanted to increase the war in Vietnam. And as the Viet Cong attacks became more intense, the United States sent more and more and more and more support, giving rise to the Vietnam War. In the United States, we typically say this was from 1964 to 1973. At its height, there were 500,000 or 500,000 U.S. troops that were trying to prevent the spread of communism to South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was a very vicious attack. So the Tet Offensive was an attack by the Viet Cong on U.S. positions. It was a very devastating defeat in terms of casualty count for North Vietnam, but it gave the perception to the United States that Vietnam was unwinnable. And after 1968, for the most part, many Americans became convinced that Vietnam could not be won, or at the very least, it's not worth being won. In 1973, the United States agreed to leave. In 1975, North Vietnam invaded the South. The United States opted in 1975 to not intervene. The capital city, or the former French capital of Saigon, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City to represent the unified and communist Vietnam. Right, so after that whole process, right, of Vietnam going from a French colony to a Japanese colony to France trying to reconquer it, to a U.S. supported leader in South Vietnam, to a Vietnam War that saw 500,000 U.S. troops become involved. Finally, in 1975, Vietnam became a unified, communist, and independent. And so when we talk about, after World War II, the two major trends being the Cold War and decolonization, Vietnam is a good example of how those two interact, because in the case we had the Cold War, again, the United States trying to prevent the spread of communism, but also decolonization, and that was the end result of Vietnam becoming an independent country, right? Vietnam becoming an independent country. Meanwhile, in neighboring Cambodia, so Cambodia is a country which neighbors Vietnam. The Vietnam War did a lot to destabilize Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, we'll call this a genocidal communist regime, caused a lot of death and destruction in Southeast Asia. Cambodia also went to war with Vietnam. So Vietnam, after becoming independent, went to war with Cambodia and later on China, in fact. And so there was still a continued destabilization in that area. Another way in which the Cold War manifested itself was not just competition over various plots of land, right? We saw, at least in the case of both Vietnam and Korea. So here's Korea. Here's what happened in Vietnam. In both of those areas, and even in Berlin, right, there was a question of whether or not a specific government or whether or not a specific territory would adopt the ideas of communism and capitalism. There's also another way in which the Cold War manifested itself, and that was really over the battle for technology, right? So the question was technology. Another term for this is the space race. So we might call the space race the competition between the US and Soviets to develop the best technology, because this was also another way to convince the world that your system was superior. The question was, well, which system's going to bring us to a futuristic, type of world, so to speak. And, the way that this manifested itself, at least very early on, was in terms of weapons. Recall that atomic weapons were developed by the United States in 1945. And so for a long time, the United States had a monopoly on atomic weapons. In 1949, the Soviet Union invented their own atomic weapons. The hydrogen bomb, which was a bigger bomb, 1952, oops. The United States developed the first hydrogen bomb. I want to say the Soviet Union did that in the same year. And in fact, in 1957, the Sputnik satellite, so the satellite, no idea how you spell satellite. Sputnik became the first satellite launched into space. Jeez, man. Launched in space. All right, the first one launched into space. So at the very least, from this technological standpoint, the United States was winning at first, having monopoly on the atomic bomb. But other developments, and eventually once the Soviets launched the very first satellite into space, it really looked like from the perspective of the US that they were falling behind. And that was the perception really throughout the 1950s. However, in 1969, the United States was the first to land a person on the moon, which was a victory for the US in terms of this technological race. Meanwhile, these weapons had, very dire consequences. The race to build bigger and badder bombs made the world in some way a more dangerous place. Nikita Khrushchev, who was premier of the Soviet Union, premier, M-E-I-R, kind of like the president. You can just think of him as like the president of the Soviet Union. And U.S. President Eisenhower, who was president from 1952 to 1960, and President Kennedy, who was president 1960 to 1963. Khrushchev, Eisenhower, and Kennedy were very aggressive in terms of the rhetoric regarding the Cold War. I mean, both threatened to use the entire arsenal, right? Nikita Khrushchev once famously said, "We will bury you." I think Eisenhower promised massive retaliation if any sort of war broke out. So the rhetoric between the Soviets and the Americans were very intense. And that came to a head in Cuba in 1962 in the form of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was probably the area or event the world got closest to a nuclear. And, by the 1960s, both the Soviets and the Americans were messing with nuclear weapons, a nuclear war. Essentially, Cuba had, for the most part, from about the Spanish-American War in the 1900s till 1959, had a very pro-American regime. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S. government. Well, it wasn't really a U.S. government, U.S.-supported government in Cuba, right? He led a Cuban revolution, turned Cuba into a communist nation and a Soviet-supported nation. This was a big problem for the U.S. because Cuba became the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. The United States essentially tried to take out Castro. That failed. When that failed, Fidel Castro asked Nikita Khrushchev for protection. Khrushchev put missiles. Right, there's a very poorly drawn missile. Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba for protection. The United States found out, said remove the missiles or else, and this sort of showdown was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, President Kennedy at the time demanded the missiles be removed from Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev pretty much said, no, I won't remove them. And the world came very, very, very close to a nuclear war. Eventually, diplomacy reigned supreme. But once again, it kind of was an illustration of just how dangerous of a world that both the Soviets and Americans and really the entire world had inhabited during the Cold War.